story of Upbuild began in a monastery. On our quest to understand ourselves more deeply, we recognize that it is our attachment to our egos, our identities, that gets in the way of being our true selves. This podcast will help you understand your ego. It will help you better understand your inner world, the motivations, insecurities, and emotions that affect your every action and relationship. Welcome to Upbuilding the Self.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another Upbuild conversation. I'm Michael Sawyer, and today we have the pleasure of having the full Upbuild team with us. So Razanath, Hari, Vipin, it's really nice to see you guys and be having this conversation with you today. Today's topic is one that is near and dear to all of our hearts and is one that is pretty much my every experience in life. And that is the intense link between self-worth and achievement. We'll be discussing what is self-worth and how can we start to detangle the link between self-worth and achievement so that the ups and downs that we experience based on our achievements and our failures don't have such a strong hold on us. And so Vipin, I'd love to kick it to you to get us started by sharing your perspective on how you think about determining your own self-worth.
One thing I've thought for a long time is that as I've worked in places where I've had a salary, it's been interesting to recognize that all of my self-worth was in some ways captured by a number that was on a paycheck every 2 weeks. My entire worth was quantified by somebody else. And just when I thought about that, it felt quite disempowering that my worth was determined by a single number and it was determined by somebody else. And then, Michael, when you joined us at Upbuild, we had a bunch of conversations collectively about how we want to really try to decouple our self-worth from the compensation the distribution that we're taking from our work. And I've thought about that a lot over the last 2 years, where it's a really nice idea in theory and a really important one. And then how do we actually do that? Because so much of my worth is entangled with what have I done? And then how have others valued me? And that's what indicates to me like, oh, okay, I have worth. And so what would it feel like to be in touch with my worth independent of any of that external validation? That must be freedom.
So it might be helpful before we dive into actually how to do that, and especially since you brought up the concept of self-esteem, if we just start with what is self-worth and how is that potentially different than what self-esteem? These terms tend to get used interchangeably, but it feels like there could be some nuanced differences that would be important to articulate.
Self-worth can sometimes feel bigger than self-esteem because self-esteem tends to fluctuate. And Michael, we were talking about this quite a lot. You were sharing about how self-esteem can fluctuate. But you can also tie that to the sense of self-worth being not very fixed. That my sense of self-worth is fluctuating when I get an email that says, "Great job, man, you're awesome, you killed it." Right? Now my sense of self-worth is very high. And then I get an email that says, "By the way, you forgot to do this. And that's, going to cause consequences for us. So, I'm a little disappointed." And that now my sense of self-worth is going down. And sometimes I try to decouple myself and just have a stiff upper lip. But that involves another big subject of shutting down my heart. So as a strategy to not be so thrown off by the constant fluctuations in our self-esteem, our sense of self-worth, we are battling with that all the time. And the most effective way to go into battle with our self-worth is by putting on armor. So we think. But when we put on armor, when we armor our hearts we barricade ourselves and we feel an incredible loneliness. It doesn't actually build our self-worth. It just protects us from some of the damage, which in certain circumstances is necessary. I mean, if somebody's going to abuse you, you need some of that armor, right? But the problem is we take that armor with us wherever we go because we're always afraid that somebody's going to abuse us. And we don't even think about it. We don't think, oh, I'm such a fearful creature. I carry my armor with me all the time because I'm so afraid. We just do it. And we think it makes us tough and that nobody can get to us. But then, there are side effects to that. The fulfillment, the tenderness, the sense of being in touch with my heart and having an emotionally rich existence. This doesn't really come very easily when we have the armor. And our workplaces are set up in such a way, don't be so emotional. Don't be so heartfelt. Just kill it. Kill it, man. Take your armor and kill it. Right? So what is that doing to us? And it all comes back to self-worth. I'm afraid that my self-worth is going to go down, but that means that there's something wrong, that it's not very fixed. Is self-worth something that should be so fickle, so fragile, that we need the armor to protect it all the time? I'm also thinking about how, you have certain celebrities, very, very successful business people, executives. They should have an incredible sense of self-worth, right? But what you often find is they're the most armored people. And sometimes they're interviewed in a magazine or on a talk show or wherever, and they look really attractive and they look so confident. I mean, we show a clip of Tiger Woods, who just couldn't be more confident. And people get so inspired by that. It's like, I want to be like that. That must feel so good to never have to question yourself, to never feel low, to believe in yourself to such a degree, to just be like on it and know that you're amazing all the time. He says, it's just a belief that you have to have. It's just a belief you have to have that I'm going to win all the time. Wouldn't that be amazing? But then you see there's a disconnect. How the person lives, it just doesn't give an accurate portrayal. You see, there's so much leaking out. I was talking about the loneliness, the disconnects with myself and with others, the fixations. It needs to find its outlet, and it's pointing at something that idea of self-worth or self-esteem based on what we do, it's not reliable. It doesn't give us a full picture. And it has absolutely nothing to do with the fixed intrinsic value of human life.
I wanted to key in on two things that you had said, Hari. One is you started with, you'd see all of these famous people who have achieved so much, or business people who are highly successful, and you would think that they would have the highest degree of self-worth. And that is, if you assume that self-worth is actually tied to a material plane or our achievements. So as you spoke, that breaks down. What you're saying is that it breaks down. Self-worth is not, we think it's tied to our achievements, but it falls apart. And so it's actually, self-worth is something that goes well beyond what we're doing, what we've achieved, what external value we have.
And yet it's so glittery that it attracts us. And sometimes we don't see or refuse to see how it breaks down. We don't even recognize the amount of suffering in the people that we admire most, who don't show us their suffering willingly.
Yeah. And the other thing you said is about being armored. So almost that you can't, if we are armored, that is divergent from feeling your self-worth. Because if you felt your self-worth, you could just show up as you are. You would be comfortable in who you are without needing to put on an armor, be a projection of yourself, project an image, etc. And so that points to something very specific regarding one's self-worth.
And I think this is what makes this so difficult for so many people, is because we have the stories of ourselves. I know I definitely have this story of myself, which is that it's kind of good that I have low self-worth, because now I'm super motivated. I'm actually out there like pushing myself, because I think if I ever felt, oh no, I'm in touch with my self-worth, I have a healthy sense of self-esteem, the story in my head, which I can see how it's false and yet it still drives me all the time, is that I would all of a sudden become this lazy person who wouldn't actually be interested in going out and trying to accomplish things and build things and make new things and meet people and, all of these things that we're doing all the time, that motivation would somehow go away if I all of a sudden became in touch with my self-worth.
Yeah. And then I was having a conversation with a client yesterday about this very topic, on not exactly self-worth, but how certain emotions can actually become drivers. And inherent in that was this whole thing about not feeling worthy enough. And so that becomes a driving force. Now, what we see invariably is that while that can maybe get us started, it's not a sustainable force. It has such a stressful effect on our entire way of being, so much so that at some point in time, we question, well, is this the way to go? And then somehow we need to convince ourselves, and this is the interesting thing, when we do not find anything else to motivate us, this is the only fuel that's left. And when we have these conversations, what I sense in the conversations itself is like, yeah, this really motivates me. And then when the person is saying that, you also see how the person is saying it and simultaneously doubting his or her assertion of that too, because I feel its effects. I know how draining it is to always be chasing after my own sense of worth. So that's one thing. The second thing that we were talking about in that same conversation I was alluding to a little earlier is the effect, the price that other people have to pay for that. Because at some point in time, my sense of self-worth becomes a relativized element, because that's the only way I can find some level of connection with self-worth. So what I have to do is, one, compare. But number two is, if I can show that other people are less than me, then somehow I feel I have a sense of self-worth. It does create suffering. There is a price that somebody else pays to keep my self-worth intact.
There are winners and losers.
I was thinking about Hari and I were having a conversation with someone that we both work with, and he was saying that if you really want to get me to do something, just tell me I can't do it, and then I will prove you wrong. And Hari asked this amazing question, which was, well, do you feel like you're being controlled then? Because all I have to do is tell you can't do something, and then I'm making you, and the conversation went on to talk about, well, only when he himself wants to do those things, so he has to be aligned with them. But there's this element of, of control, and I am at the behest of needing to prove to others to feel my worth and my value. The other thing I was thinking about this, Michael, you'd said about laziness. Like, if I feel my sense of worth, well, I'm done. I'm not driven anymore. And I think that the way that I have experienced this, it's not like one's ambition goes away. It's just that the object of that ambition changes. So in organizational settings, we spend so much time trying to align an individual's incentives with the organizational's incentives, because we recognize that everyone's sort of out for themselves because they need to prove their worth. And there are all these little mini divergences within the organization where we're not all working in a unified, cohesive manner towards the organization's best interests. I'm working for my best interests and the organization's, maybe 50-50. And that's happening for thousands of people. What kind of sort of loss factor is there when that's happening? Now, all of a sudden, what happens if I'm truly in touch with my worth, if I have that sense of self-worth, I can really work for the benefit of others without needing to work for the benefit of myself all the time. And I'm not there yet myself, but I think just maybe slightly closer to my own self-worth than I may have been years ago. And in seeing that, yeah, like I can act more in service of others and the organization. And then what would happen in an organization if everyone were more in touch with their self-worth? Would that organization get lazy and just shut down? Or would that organization thrive in a way that you've never seen?
And also, when we talk about this idea that, like, well, I'll do this because it's aligned with my values, where do those values come from? Is there not an element of control in how we value things, right? That's the overarching piece that is so crazy. I mean, it's mind-boggling. How do you navigate that? Where is freedom when society is set up this way, when we've been raised a certain way? Coming back full circle. So to work and to act and to live with real freedom, it requires something tremendously different. It has to be so off the grid from what is our experience currently, where it's like, you tell me what my worth is, and I tell myself if I value what I want to do, but where do those values come from? It comes from a collection of people's values. So we have to really, to decouple self-worth from achievement, it requires a lot. I mean, the detangling runs deep, man.
And it is an existential experience, right? When we talk about self-worth, it's, well, when my stock price, quote unquote, my stock price falls, it has a very existential effect to it. But then the important thing here is to ask the question, well, what is this? Which self are we talking about? And so much of our work at Upbuild is actually fundamentally based on the premise of the self and understanding the self. And my experience of this is the self shows up in two ways. The self that we typically talk about is what we call the egoic self. The self that needs an external validation for the sake of establishing its identity and feeling its identity constantly. And then we talk about the true self, which is much deeper than the egoic self. And the egoic self is covering the true self in a certain way. So when we talk about the self and me, I, or my sense of self-worth, typically our conversations are around the egoic self. That sense of self that is in constant need of external validation for the sake of experiencing itself and to establish its identity very strongly. So if we are talking about that egoic self, then a lot of questions are raised. And our understanding of the egoic self is that the egoic self is never really satisfied. It's like feeding somebody that's constantly hungry. The more food you put, the more it requires because of its fragility. Because its existence depends so much on the constant feeding, it's fragile. It doesn't have its own existence. It doesn't have a sense of its own self. The ego is afraid of becoming healthy, becoming strong, because then what is its purpose, right? It somehow, the ego derives its sense of self from being fragile, and that becomes its driving force. But there's something wrong with it, and it knows it, it feels it. And so now I can't really determine what I would do if I didn't experience my fragility, quote unquote, what we call drive, because then what will motivate me to work in the world? So the bigger question here is, what self are we talking about? Are we talking about the egoic self, or are we talking about our truest self?
So where does that leave us?
Well, it's a work in progress. And I think what's important here is to not neglect the egoic self, but actually the egoic self is a means to actually go towards the true self. but it's not the true self. What's important is that the egoic self is actually built in a healthy fashion. And this is what brings us to the deeper definition of maybe self-esteem and self-worth, is in order for us to let go of the egoic self. And this is what Richard Rohr talks about in his book, Falling Upward. And he talks about two halves of life. He talks about the first half of life being the work of building that healthy egoic self. And then that becomes the platform on which the second half of life, which is actually letting that egoic self fall by the wayside so that we can experience our true self, can be done. So the work here to begin with is to actually build that healthy sense of egoic self, because the ego needs enough to be able to let go. But the question that we have to ask ourselves is, what is the point at which we can let go? We don't really intentionally, deliberately draw that line because everything is so relativized. And so what's important for us is to ask, well, okay, how much of validation, how much of sense of self-worth that I derive from the external world is enough? After which I put a cap, and then, the pursuit goes in a different direction.
The challenge is that's like being in quicksand and saying like, okay, now I'm just going to jump out after I reach a certain level. I've fallen in, I'm down to my knees now, and now I'm going to jump out because I'm at the knee point. The thing is, this stuff is so sticky, right? The moment you engage with that mentality, it is so sticky, and it can be arrogant to think, okay, now I have full control. I've gotten to this level and I'm done. Finished. I'm so disciplined and so good. It really invites, yes, we need a certain amount of accomplishment. We need a certain amount of validation. But in what way are we approaching it? Because if we approach it in the same way and just say, well, this will be my stopping point, there is like a 99% chance that we will not be able to stop, or we will forget that we were even trying to stop. And we'll end up in a completely different place. And we'll be buried with the game, the ego game. And it's interesting because Carl Jung had come up with this paradigm that is so powerful, which Richard Rohr draws from, of the two halves of life. And needing to build up a healthy sense of self within the world, the ego, so that you're not constantly insecurely looking for the thing that you're attached to that you didn't get. Because if you have a pain in your side, the only thing you can think about is stopping that pain. So if you have a pain in your ego, the only thing you can think about is stopping that pain, just getting some satisfaction. Yes, this person likes me. Yes, I made something happen. Yes, I feel good about myself. That becomes the fixation. And then again, as we said, so when you feel like you're no longer in that amount of pain, that you can think a little bit more broadly, then you can give up the ego gradually, right? So there is definitely something to that. Interestingly, he also was sort of lamenting that he hadn't invested enough in the self. He had done all of this incredible work at sort of distinguishing the self from the ego in a way. I mean, he had his own frameworks, but he was so good with understanding the psychology and giving some helpful roadmaps. And at the same time, he was dissatisfied that he hadn't invested enough in the self. So we can work at breaking down our egos like crazy, or we can work at building up our egos so that we can break them down, which is even further removed, right? But at a certain point, we have to ask ourselves, when am I going to invest in what really is the actual self? That is so, I mean, that's what everything hinges on. And then when you invest in that, how much more strength do we have? And it also goes back to your point about mirroring, Rasanat, that, when you're mirrored by people who see your actual self and are pouring into your actual self, that's a wonderful, wonderful starting point. right? As long as we are mirrored by people that are looking at our egos, they're reinforcing the hall of mirrors that this world gives us. And that's what's happening nonstop, all the time. It's just constant. So we have to, again, break out of this. And a great starting point is there anybody that sees me for my real self? And what does that even mean? And that becomes really a spiritual question.
Yeah, I was thinking that in order to even begin to decouple worth from achievement, you have to believe that I have worth independent of achievement. And then you really, at least as far as I can see, what is the basis for that? Either that I have worth, just human life is equally worthy across the board. So I have, but in the world, in the environment that we live in, we don't actually believe that. In the conditioned environment, it doesn't feel like all lives have equal worth. I mean, there's lots that we can say about that. The other sort of basis for feeling that I have worth that's independent of my doing, that's independent, it's just based on my being, you end up down a spiritual platform of like, that is the basis for my worth, which is that I am a soul, I'm spirit, and that spirit is connected to something much larger. And that's the basis for my worth. And so, yeah, you can't think about this without stepping into a spiritual paradigm.
Yeah, because otherwise, by default, it's social Darwinism. And it's happening unbeknownst to us, where we're saying, if only this guy was motivated to work hard like I am, then he wouldn't be such a loser. The problem is I'm surrounded by incompetent people that just don't get it. They don't have the drive. And, so my basic philosophy there, it's unstated, but only the strong survive. Either you get it or you don't. And evolution made us this way, and it's a good thing. So let me be one of the strong. But then it becomes hypocritical to talk about equal rights and equality. I'm such an egalitarian and a humanitarian, and I just, I care about the state of the world and people. Why? If there are some people that are going to die out because, and we don't take it to this extreme, but this is what it's pointing at. If some people are going to die out because they're weak, but I'm going to be the strong one, what does that say about my care for humanity?
Well, the response typically to something like that is, well, I need them. So I have to keep them interested enough so that then I can feel like I can, I can derive my sense of worth from, those people. So like you have to become big, but only just big enough that then others are interested enough in the game so that, and this just seems, it seems sadistic, doesn't it? You keep others alive for your own sense of self-worth. There is no love. There is no genuine relationship in that kind of a worldview. There is no selflessness in that kind of a worldview.
And you can't have equality because it doesn't make sense. As Vipin was saying, like, we are not all equal. We are not all equal contributors to the world. We don't have all the same morality, the same level of high morals. We don't have the same level of output. Like, there is constant inequality just based on how we are. And you cannot equalize it. So it becomes just a wishful thinking that sounds nice. So unless there's some spiritual fabric, then all of this is just an intellectual exercise to make us feel good about ourselves, that we are caring and moral people, which we want to be, which is good. We should want to be that. But what is it based on? Does it hold up?
One of the things that's been a helpful framing for me in this is thinking about intentions and how even below the surface of different qualities in people's moral character is still a pure intention somewhere buried there, like this desire. And I think this is where, again, we're kind of moving into the spiritual here, but this desire for unconditional love. And so if we can get in touch with that, we can start to detangle the link here between self-worth and achievement.
Yeah, the self-worth exists. We're just not able to see it. It's there. It's inherent. And the whole struggle of searching for self-worth is that we are out of touch with ourself. And when we are out of touch with ourself, then how do we know what the self is worth? That's where fundamentally it starts. And so now, then in the process of actually reclaiming it, unfortunately, then we try to reclaim it in ways that doesn't necessarily get us in touch with that self. But also in the process of trying to reclaim it, we also perhaps, and this is true for why we see so much suffering in the world, is that in the unhealthy pursuit of my self-worth, I actually tend to destroy a lot of people's self-worth. So I don't think we have, in that sense of the term, I don't think we have a choice but to actually try and get in touch with our real self. Because that's the starting point.
I think maybe closing with what's at stake if we don't. I guess that's what you're pointing at, that we'll just we will destroy other people's self-worth in the process. But what's at stake for ourselves also?
One of the things is that we actually go after the wrong things. We start working on problems that are going to get us that immediate feeling of validation or that immediate feeling of worth. But in the long run, those aren't the things that we should actually be spending our time on.
Yeah, they won't satisfy us. The self is interesting. We talked about the ego being hungry, but the self is even hungrier. The self is saying, when will you feed me, right? Now you got two hungry people because the ego is never satisfied and the self hasn't even been touched. So that's where you get this kind of vacuousness, and we avoid it like anything. We avoid it. We try to fill it up with things that will distract us, things that will self-medicate and numb us. The armor has to be on so heavy. We pride ourselves in our armor and our fighting ability, but we feel so empty. And that's the reason for all of that. Who wants to live with that emptiness? I mean, every day I pick up a news story and it's just about emptiness. It's just about how people are experiencing so much emptiness. It's not stated in those terms, but the only way you can explain the actions of the people in the news are because of this extraordinary, inconquerable emptiness that needs to be filled so desperately. And so we may be with a smaller appetite, we may have less proving than the people that we read about or hear about or watch. But, the disease is the same. It's just about how out of control the disease is, but we still have the same disease, myself included. And it is a constant work in progress to treat it. There needs to be a treatment plan for getting rid of this vacuum, filling it with something that will not just make it fall into a black hole. Actually, feeding the self is the greatest need. Otherwise, we'll forever be thinking, oh, if I move here, if I only had this spouse, if I have this bank account, if I have this setup in my life, if only there weren't this pandemic, then I would be happy. Then I would have enough feeling of worth. It doesn't work. It never works. It never works. There's always something more. And we think, oh, well, that's what makes life exciting. That, I don't know what the next adventure is to be had to get to the goal. And if I were to get to the goal, then what would be the point of my life? Then I could stop living, right? So I'm always chasing. But it's a treadmill. It's a hamster in a wheel. It's not what it promises to be. And I always give the example of George Harrison because I'm so inspired by his conclusion that he reached the top and he said, are you kidding me? This is it? This is what everybody dreams of? This is what everybody thinks like in my wildest imagination, if only, I don't want anything to do with this. And he actually invested in his real self. He became such an ardent spiritualist and a songwriter for self-realization. That's incredible. And he's not the only person that's come to that conclusion. But it's a very, very powerful example because it can stop us in our tracks. We don't have to wait until we get there, because we're probably not going to get to his height of success before we say, wait a minute, is this really what I'm after? Is this really what I need?
And bringing it back to, Richard Rohr's concept of the first half of life, the second half of life, even if we are on the first half of life, and even if we are trying to fill up some of the needs of the ego, we can still very much have our eyes on the second half of life.
It's hard to build the first half of life in a healthy way without having our eyes on the second half.
That's it. That's the approach I was talking about.
That's the key. It's impossible to do it. You have to have your eyes on the long-term goal in order to even build things in short term that are aligned with what's in the long term. Now, while they may look very differently externally, because our eyes and our hearts are actually focused on the second half, the first half will be built for that purpose. So you're absolutely right that we are going about our lives and we still need to work with our egoic selves, not neglect it, as I mentioned earlier, with the understanding that we are building it for the sake of getting in touch with our real self, and not for its own standalone purpose, because that is where the problem is.
And we're skeptical about what we're building as we're building it. We don't invest. We're not building this house of cards thinking the wind will never blow, the wind will never blow, the wind will never blow. This is it. Oh, finally, I got the last card in place. We're building the house of cards so that when the wind blows, we say, oh, I knew all along that this wasn't the real thing. I just needed to do my project so that I would be satisfied. At least I tried.
Thank you for listening to Upbuilding the Self. Upbuild is a leadership development company that offers workshops, coaching, and other services to help you on the path towards being your best self, free from the shackles of the ego. To learn more about our work, visit our website, upbuild.com, and sign up for our newsletter to gain access to podcasts, reflections, and upcoming events. If you enjoyed this episode, please go to iTunes to leave us a review so that others can find and benefit from the podcast. We look forward to being with you again next time.